Alright, this is Unit 4, Video 5, U.S. History, and this is the causes of the Civil War. So these are some immediate causes leading up to. First off, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In the 1850s, Congress decided to open up the lands that today make up Kansas and Nebraska for settlement. And just like every time we've had new land, the question of slavery comes up. Congress decided to solve the issue of whether or not to allow slavery in that territory by using popular sovereignty, which is what they used in New Mexico with the Compromise of 1850. They would allow voters to go, or people to move there and then vote on whether or not they wanted slavery in that territory. And popular sovereignty means rule by the people. So sovereignty is rule, and so popular is just the people. And this would allow the citizens to vote and determine that question. Now, it essentially ended the 36-30 line that we talked about being established in the Missouri Compromise. The settlers themselves would now be able to decide whether or not they wanted slavery there. And this resulted in thousands of pro- and anti-slavery settlers flooding the territory to try and get a majority for that vote. So if more pro-slavery people were there, then they could make it a slave state. And if it was more anti-slavery folks, then they could make it a free state. Both sides ended up electing their own government. They wrote their own constitution. They raised their own armies. And as you might imagine, chaos ensued. The area became called Bleeding Kansas, as pro and anti-slavery forces basically went to war with each other to determine the future of slavery in that territory. And it's really a preview of the war to come. This is a preview of the Civil War. We've got over 200 people killed in Kansas, with pro and anti-slavery folks going at it. And the bloodshed in Kansas showed that this idea of popular sovereignty had failed. And that's a key that the Standard wants you to know, is that you need to see how popular sovereignty failed in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is the Kansas territory, Nebraska territory, and this is really the main area for the fighting and the division right through here that you see on this map. So why did popular sovereignty fail in Kansas after this act? Largely because the people themselves were so passionate about either wanting slavery or not wanting slavery that they really couldn't exist in that close of contact with each other, and so they went to war with each other essentially rather than working it out, politically. And how did the Kansas-Nebraska Act deepen the divide between the North and South? This is, as I said, this is really a preview. So, I mean, not only do you have people arguing, but now you have people actually taking up arms and shooting at each other, killing each other. And so this division between the North and the South is going to continue to grow, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act makes that even worse with the warfare. All right, next up we're going to talk about a Supreme Court case. Dred Scott was a slave, and in 1857 he sued for his freedom. His argument was that his master had moved to a free state and taken Dred Scott with him, and so he should be free, right? So he was purchased in a slave state, but when they moved to a free state, Dred Scott said, well, this is a free state. You can't have slaves here, and so he sued for his freedom. And remarkably, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court ruling that Dred Scott could not even be a citizen because he was black. It also ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because Congress couldn't regulate slavery in federal territories. The Dred Scott case gave slavery the protection of the federal government. It was a big loss for anti-slavery folks, and it showed that even the Supreme Court was behind the institution of slavery, supporting it. This is Dred Scott on the left, and this is the Chief Justice Roger B. Taney on the right, who ruled in the Dred Scott decision. Talk about John Brown's raid now. John Brown was a white guy who had actually moved out to Kansas during the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he was one of the guys that took place in Bleeding Kansas. He took part in that, and he and his sons killed 5 pro-slavery men at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas with broadswords. So this guy was, he believed God wanted him to end slavery, even if that meant through violence. And so John Brown was, this was a very crucial issue for him. In 1859, John Brown led a raid on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is modern-day West Virginia. His plan was to arm slaves in this massive slave uprising, but it failed because the slaves really didn't know what was going on, and Brown was convicted of treason against Virginia, not against the U.S., but against the state of Virginia, and he was hanged for his crimes. There you see two different pictures of John Brown. Here he is. This is probably about the time he went to Kansas, and this is just around the time of his hanging. The raid polarized both sides on the slavery issue even more. Northerners saw John Brown as a martyr, someone who was dying for this great cause, while Southerners really saw him as a terrorist. And this is called the engine house, where John Brown and his followers were kind of trapped when they came in and captured them. But you can go to Harper's Ferry today in West Virginia, and this building stands, and you can go in there. It's pretty neat. And then we have the 1860 election. The real catalyst for secession of the southern states was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. As expected, slavery was a major issue in this election, and Lincoln believed that slavery should not be allowed in new territories. He wanted to leave slavery alone where it already existed. So in southern states that had slavery, he didn't want to end slavery there. He knew the problems that would cause with the South. He just didn't want it to expand. However, the South saw that as an attack on slavery. In the Electoral College, Lincoln was victorious because he carried the northern states, which had many more people, so they had more electoral votes than the South. He wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. And so upon his election, South Carolina voted to leave the United States, and that word there is secede when they chose to leave. Many other southern states followed their lead, and the election of Lincoln really had been the trigger for that. You can see here Charleston Mercury, so this would be a South Carolina newspaper. After South Carolina voted to leave the United States, the Union is dissolved, and this is their ordinance of secession in South Carolina that they signed there. And if you want to pause the video, you can read through this, but it talks about how they signed the Constitution on the 23rd day of May, and basically how the time has come to dissolve that union. So your questions here: how the Dred Scott decision worsened North and South relations? Well, the North is terrified after this case because they see that the Supreme Court is actually backing slavery, that they're protecting slavery in this case of Dred Scott. And so that makes the North even more concerned about slavery and what it might do to the country, with the South kind of seeing it as a good decision made by the Supreme Court. In John Brown's raid, what did that prove about the fight against slavery in the United States? John Brown's raid, and he says this later, but it pretty much shows that the issue of slavery is going to be a violent one. It's not going to be something that just is decided. It's only going to end with violence, and Brown believed that, and that's one of the reasons that he took a violent stance going all the way back to Kansas, Nebraska. And then finally, how did the South respond following the 1860 election? And then why did they respond that way? So the South responded really by seceding. They left the Union. They formed their own country, a confederation, Confederate states, where the states had more power. And the reason they responded that way is because they thought Lincoln was going to end slavery. Despite Lincoln never saying that was his goal, he did say that he wanted to stop the expansion of slavery, but Southerners heard that as an attack on the institution of slavery itself, and so they decided that the Union was no longer for them, and we get 11 states that are going to leave.